On the spots of difference. I hope that you got a few. So hello everyone. Thank you very much for choosing to come to the session today amongst all the other really good stuff that's happening, or for taking the time out to catch up on the recording if that's what you're doing. I'm Alyssa. I'm from the National Mind Information Team. And this session is going to be looking at the ways violence is stigmatized in society and how we can destigmatize our approach to that topic to enable us to speak with care at times when people with mental health problems are involved in violence. It's not so much about dealing with individuals who have been violent, but the way we as a broader organization talk about violence as part of an anti-stigma mission. Just to prepare you for the nature of this session, it's a live lounge session, which means it's mostly listening. There's not any interactive elements or breakout rooms that are going to surprise you. It's just me talking, which I hope is fairly interesting. In the calendar, this session is scheduled to be like an hour and a half long, but it's not me talking. It's not going to take that long. My talking bit is about 45 minutes. But then I will stay on if anyone does have any questions or wants to have a chat about anything, but that bit's totally optional as well. If you do decide to leave after I've done all the talking bits, I encourage you not to dive instantly back into work. Please take some extra time to reflect on what we've learned or just take a well-being break because this is quite a full-on topic. So give yourself the time to process it if you need to. I'm also sure that we probably have quite a range of experience in the session today. Some of you, everything I say might be stuff you've already heard before. Other people might find this quite new. All are welcome, but also I won't feel offended if anyone feels they want to drop off because this is something they already know inside and out. My colleagues Amy, Louise and Lottie are monitoring the chat and posting some helpful links and notes as we go along. Tanya is also here to monitor the tech side of things. My internet has been a bit tricky this morning, as of course is going to happen on a day you do a big presentation. So we will work around that if there's any problems, but hopefully we're all okay. So this is just the agenda of what the presentation is going to cover. So we will start with some session guidelines and content warnings. This is a very sensitive topic, so I think it's important that we're all on the same page about that and how to have a constructive session. Then I'll give a brief introduction to the info team so you know who we are and why it's worth listening to us talk about this sort of stuff. Then we will explore the concept of violence and how it's stigmatized in society, both generally and in terms of mental health problems. Then we will look at how we can start to deconstruct some of those stigmas. And then we will look specifically at where mental health and violence intersect. The very last bit, we're just going to take a look at some examples of how National Mind have approached writing about mental health and violence and suggest some tips that might be helpful to you. Then I will stop talking and you can either take a break or stay for a little bit of discussion if you would like to. But as I said, that's totally optional. So let's start with the basic session guidelines and content warnings. This is a very intense topic, so it is really important that we're all conscious of each other's well-being in the session. Just to be very clear up front, in the presentation, I will mention stabbing, stalking, racism, and death and harm to children. That includes examples of media headlines that might talk about mental health and violence in a stigmatizing way and sometimes are a little bit graphic. I won't be going into graphic detail about any of these topics. But they will be mentioned, so just be aware of that. So just the session guidelines. First up, cameras can be off. Engage however you feel most comfortable. I'm really not bothered by that at all. As we've said, take a break if you need to. If the content is too heavy or personal, you're just more than welcome to step away. If you have any concerns after the session, you can get in touch with me or the info team, and please engage in any relevant wellbeing services on offer if you do need those as well. Please keep your mics muted if you're not speaking. It might be worth just double checking that you're all on mute now if you want to. Thank you very much. Please ask any questions kindly and respectfully, so keep the well-being of your colleagues in mind. I'm really happy for discussion to happen on the side in the chat, but please keep it focused to the topic at hand and within the accountable space guidelines. Amy and Lottie are kind of there in the chat. Please follow any guidance that they give if they do want to redirect around a topic or anything, because we can always keep the discussion going after the presentation. Ideally, we don't want to be using any stigmatizing language to talk about violence or mental health problems in questions or in the chat. But I also understand that this session is focused on learning what those stigmas are. So we're not going to get mad at anyone that uses language that isn't totally perfect, but we might offer a really gentle suggestion of how we could rephrase things. That's not about policing what everybody is saying, but it's just about learning together how we can all talk more respectfully. And connected with that, if you do ask a question or contribute to the chat, just consider how much detail you need to give about things like violence. You might be really comfortable talking about those topics, but not everybody's going to be comfortable hearing it. So only be specific when relevant. I've designed the presentation to sort of limit as much as possible how graphic I get about violence. That's not about like shying away from the nature of the topic. It's just about making this a topic everyone can engage in safely and productively. Then finally, questions are going to be answered at the end. If you have any, you can put them in the chat as you go, and there's also the Q&A tab as well. Amy and Lottie are going to keep an eye on those things and make sure they get answered at the end. But I'm not going to be looking at the chat or any of that. I'm going to like laser focus into this presentation. So we'll just address them at the end. They might be able to answer some of the questions, simple questions in the chat as we go, but otherwise we'll just do it all at the end if that's okay with you. I also just want to highlight that this presentation is about how we should talk about and manage violence professionally and how we can better represent people with mental health problems. It's not a critique of how anyone might have responded to violence in their personal life. That's often a really traumatic experience, and how we react to that is very personal. You're entitled to that reaction, and this presentation isn't meant to be directed at that. All right. So with all that done, I'm now just going to talk about who the info team is, which hopefully explains who I am and why it's worth listening to me, I guess. So the information team are responsible for researching, writing and editing the information about mental health on the Mind website. Our adult information officers write those bits there, and our young people team write those bits. There is a separate legal team who writes those bits of information, but our editors help them with that. Our information is really extensive. We write about specific mental health problems, treatments, and general well-being topics like money and mental health. This is from the landing page of our OCD information, which shows the kind of depth we get into on these topics. And all of our topics are extensively researched and follow a very rigorous creation process. And this is because we need to make sure that our information is PIF compliant. And PIF is the Patient Information Forum. They run the only quality mark system for online and print health information in the UK. The NHS uses it, lots of other charities use it. And all of our information pages have this PIF tick at the bottom to let people know that we are compliant. And to be PIF compliant, your information needs to kind of do all of these things that are popping up now. That includes making sure information is regularly updated and informed by people with lived experience. Don't worry about reading all of those right now. It's just kind of to show off how much work we're doing. Amy has popped a link to the PIF criteria in the chat if you are interested in it at all. Our information is also optimized to make it easy to understand. We use tools that check the reading age of what we write, and we design the layout of pages to make it easy for people to find what they need, particularly if they're in crisis. And our print booklets are also based on that information that's written with that process. So as a result of all that, our information officers, of which I am one, spend a lot of time researching and thinking about mental health. It's the core of what we do. We read books and watch documentaries as like part of our work day. We dive into Reddit debates and academic footnotes to understand from as many angles as possible how people are experiencing a mental health problem. So when you consult our team, you're consulting people who are employed to think about nuance and tough topics all the time. And we also often do deep dives and internal briefings on emerging topics. So we recently wrote 2 internal reports on AI and mental health. Lottie did that, it was really great. And GLP-1s in mental health, which I did. And we're also encouraged to develop special interests where they can be of benefit to Mind. And my special interest is stigma around violence and mental health. So hopefully that covers where we're coming from. And now that the admin is done, we can actually finally talk about the topic of violence. So first off, we're going to look at the concept of violence itself. This is really important because violence in general is a very stigmatized behavior, and we aren't really encouraged in society to think about it with understanding. Then we're going to touch on how this feeds into stigmas around mental health. So we're going to start by actually defining what I mean by violence for this presentation. Violence is a very broad term, and there are a lot of ways that we can define it. That can include institutional violence, conflict-based violence, and self-directed violence. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're just talking about violence as an interpersonal act, which I'm going to define simply as when one person causes physical harm to another person. That can include things like abuse, murder, assault, things along those lines. Interpersonal violence is the kind of violence we talk about when it comes to mental health and violence. That's why it's the focus, not because the other forms aren't important or related to mental health. It's just not kind of what we talk about in this area. And just a little note on language as well. In the presentation, I'm going to be using the terms like we, us, and you to talk about reactions and interpretations of violence at a social level. This language isn't meant to be describing how Mind or those of us attending the session today see violence necessarily, but how we as a larger society understand it. So for example, I might say, we see violence as, or we think it's okay to talk about violence this way. So yeah, I'm not directing it at us or Mind. That's just about how society talks about it. But I do think it's useful to use that language anyway, because it reminds us that we are part of those larger narratives and we aren't immune from its impacts. If it does get confusing at any point, though, pop it in the chat and hopefully one of us can clarify for you. And then I also want to make it clear that by understanding violent behavior, we're not excusing it. Part of the social narrative around violence is the assumption that any attempt to humanize or understand people who have been violent is disrespectful or something that lets people off the hook. And that's really not the case. In order to address an issue, you just need to understand it. And understanding why someone has been violent doesn't make what they've done okay. It just gives us crucial information about how we can actually tackle it. So we need to have that understanding to support people effectively on both sides, people who've been violent, people who've been harmed by violence. So definitions out of the way. We're going to look at how some of the stigmatizing ways that we view society in the society, we view violence in the society that we live in. So violence is a word with a lot of deep social meaning and layers of stigma associated with it. And these are some of the ways that we see as acceptable to talk and think about violence and people who have been violent. We see these stigmas represented in the media, but also in the way we just talk about it in everyday conversation. The first one that's popped up there is that we see violence as a contextual judgment of someone's actions. So what that means is that socially, we might see violence, certain acts as violent in one context, but not another. You might think that we consider crimes like killing someone violent all the time. But if you think about it, that's really not how we talk about it at all. So for example, if someone was killed in self-defense, we talk about that very different to how we would talk about someone being killed in like a fit of rage. And we're much more likely to call one of those things violent at all than the other one. Factors like racism also impact how we describe behaviors, as we know that people belonging to certain races and groups are more likely to be seen as violent. And the law is another way that we legally describe violence, and there are many acts we consider criminally violent now that weren't considered so in the past. So that means what we see as violent can change and be very contextual, and as social norms change, so will what we see as violent. We often see violence talked about as an inherent trait someone has. So it's not uncommon to hear someone to be referred to as a violent person. And that could be someone who's committed a lot of acts of violence or someone who was just violent once. Talking like this can make violence seem like it's an inherent trait in people. And this judgment is heavily influenced by other biases and prejudices we have about certain groups like race and class again. And media stories will often conflate those biases together. So they'll mention characteristics of perpetrators that create associations between those characteristics and violence. We're seeing that at the moment in crime reporting that emphasizes immigration status of perpetrators. I think we're all aware of the very complicated background of that decision making, but we also know that this kind of reporting forces connections between migrants and violent crime. And that's really stigmatizing, particularly when there are very few positive stories about migrants out there that give a more holistic image of the population. We also often talk about violence as evil, inhuman, malicious, and intended, with the assumption that people who do violence intend to cause harm and do so because they enjoy causing harm to people. And that pushes the narrative that violence can't be explained or understood by normal human beings. And reporting on violence will often not really bother to explain the reasons why someone has been violent. These assumptions are presented as enough of an explanation. And kind of connected with that, we also often describe violence as cold and emotionless. When we see violence described in the news, it often comes with assumptions that anyone that could do harm to another person must have no feelings or be some kind of monster. And connected with all of that, we see the best way of managing violence then to be through punishment, with the thinking that that's a deterrent for that individual, but also anyone else who might be thinking about becoming violent. And there isn't really great encouragement to understand violence, and attempting to do so can often be seen as being disrespectful to victims of violence, as we've sort of covered. And that stigma is compounded when you bring mental health into the mix. So I talked to our friends in the National Mind media team for their insights on how stigma around mental health and violence are conflated in the press. Just so you're aware, this slide is going to contain screenshots of news reports that have quite intense language about violence and very stigmatizing language about mental health. So language was a very big one. You might see phrases like psycho or loony or crazed when violence is described. That might be describing someone with a mental health problem, or it might be used as a way to describe violence in general. That creates stigmatizing connections between violence and mental health that is insensitive and misleading. People with mental health problems may also be described using that monster and evil-based language we looked at on the previous slide. Similarly, headlines are sometimes used to foreground a diagnosis. So, for example, in this one, you've got schizophrenic man, which is a very stigmatizing term anyway. We'll explore later that some mental health problems have a closer connection to violence than others, but kind of foregrounding it in this way implies that they are inevitably connected to violence and strips away a lot of the nuance we will explore in how certain mental health problems come to manifest in violent behavior. These stories often lacked context about treatments, recovery, or systemic issues that influence symptoms, and it contributes to public fear around mental health problems. This is connected to the habit of journalism to decontextualize a diagnosis in general, as has been done in this headline. Schizophrenia is a diagnosis with a range of symptoms. Some of those are depressive symptoms, which cause withdrawal and low mood, and some are experiences of psychosis. But experiences of psychosis, as we'll explore later, are also very widely varied. But a report won't explain that, oh, it's one person's manifestation of psychosis that led to violence. It's just going to say schizophrenic man was violent. That's what it's going to do. So this sort of reporting contributes to public stigma around the diagnoses and conveys the message that violence is an inevitable consequence of those sort of mental health problems. So to understand and approach violence constructively as professionals, we need to look beyond those assumptions that we see in media and our everyday language. And to do that, we need to understand a few things. So firstly, we need to understand that violence is a behavior, and behaviors are expressions of needs. Violence can happen as a result of someone not knowing how to manage certain feelings, as a learned behavior, as a defensive behavior, for a lot of reasons, but there are actual reasons there. There can be a range of reasons why it can happen, or why someone feels it's the way they need to act in a certain situation. And those behaviors aren't created in a vacuum. Significant risk factors for violent behavior in young people, for example, are history of abuse, unsupportive family structures, poor access to education, and a lack of safe environments. There are systemic causes of violence that we lose sight of when we portray violence as something that's rooted entirely in one person's decision-making. Understanding the need behind that behavior doesn't excuse it or erase the idea of someone having personal responsibility for their actions. But when we understand these individual and social reasons behind a behavior, it helps us understand how to address it much more productively and put in interventions at an individual level, but also a social level. Secondly, we need to approach this without thinking about people as good or bad. Social stigmas around violence are grounded in this idea of people being either good or bad, which leaves very little room for the grey area that everyone exists in all the time. It also contributes to the very reactive and defensive nature that we approach questions about violence with. When thinking about violence, we often put ourselves in the shoes of the victim because we all like to think of ourselves as good people. For example, when we think of how to deal with violent behavior, we're often coming at it from the perspective of, well, if someone hurt me, I would want XYZ thing to happen to them, rather than the perspective of, well, if I hurt someone else, this is the reason I might have done that, or this is what would help me stop doing that. We have all been involved in harming someone else in some way or form. That's obviously going to be to very different degrees, but it is important to tap into that reality to address this behavior in others. To understand violence as a behavior, it is important to consider behaviors in general outside of the scope of good or bad. And I'm not saying anything that people here don't already know. People are very complicated beings. No one's really good or bad. We all know that. And the labels that we give things around good or bad are very contextual, and the social norms of goodness and badness will change over time. But we do also need to remember that people don't need to be good to deserve help. And it is not just good people who were violent by accident or in self-defense or under any of those codifiers we've talked about that deserve justice and fair treatment. Everybody deserves justice and fair treatment. Accepting that doesn't mean jumping to the conclusion that violence doesn't cause harm to people. Again, no part of understanding violence involves absolving people of accountability, but stripping people and behaviors of those binary labels actually helps us create spaces of accountability and helps us consider people as a whole rather than define them by one action or behavior. And it really helps us target those root causes of violent behavior. And we also need to understand the emotions involved in violence. Violence, and definitely certain types of extreme violence, as we talked about, are often portrayed as something cold, emotionless, and evil. And because structures like media outlets aren't seeking to understand the factors that contribute to someone becoming violent, they don't convey the vast array of emotions that are associated with violence. We see violence as something lacking emotion rather than often being an indication of someone not being able to handle or regulate too many emotions or one very, very strong emotion. And if lack of emotion is a factor, which sometimes it is, that response also has a very complex interplay of causes as well. Fear and anger are really big drivers of violence, and there are a lot of factors that lead someone to express those emotions through violence. That's something we often try and skirt around with kind of statements or beliefs like, well, I feel angry, but I'm not violent towards other people. Or, yeah, that thing frustrated me, but I didn't hurt anyone because of it, and I'd never do that. Or even something like, well, I have a mental health problem, but it never made me hurt anybody. But those kind of beliefs ignore the nuance of upbringing and social privileges that influence our behavior and the experience of certain mental health problems. You being able to express and feel your emotions in a way that is not violent is not something inherently virtuous about you. It is not something that you were born being able to do, and not everybody is taught or given the space to express their emotions safely. There are privileges of education, safety, support, and so much more that contribute to how you manage your emotions. Some of us here are going to have parents who taught us to like walk away from a fight, right? And some of us have parents that taught us that it's okay to engage in a fight. There's just so many little things like that that build up to how we react in certain situations. And again, that doesn't make violence okay or mean you get a let off the hook, but understanding the emotional roots of violence can help us address it productively. And we shouldn't consider non-violence the default form of dealing with emotions, that people who are violent have kind of deviated from maliciously or intentionally. And finally, we need to acknowledge that violence doesn't exist outside of normal human behavior. Violence is often reported as an inhuman act, as we saw before, but violence is a thing that humans do, so it can't be inhuman. It's not necessarily an innate or inevitable part of being human, but it is something that humans do under certain conditions and pressures. It's something we do if we're unsafe or if we aren't seeing the world as safe, potentially due to a mental health problem. When we consider certain actions to be outside the category of humanity, we associate those who commit violence as outside of or below humanity, and that has a number of effects. So firstly, it allows you to disassociate the behavior from yourself and see it as like an other behavior. As we discussed before, we don't want to see ourselves as bad or inhuman or monstrous, so we don't associate violence with something that we could do. It makes those who seek to understand violent behavior or seek justice for people who show violent behavior as disrespectful to the victims of crime. It convinces us that the violence is something innate in someone rather than the product of a complex interaction of personal and environmental factors. And it convinces us that we need to address violence through punishment, because a monster or something inhuman, you can't rehabilitate that and you can't make that thing good. So all you can do is punish them or lock them away from society so they can't hurt anyone else. Our justice system and narratives about justice focus very heavily on these ideas of violence being beyond or below humanity and thus beyond understanding or reform. And we have very, very few services that support people with violent behaviour, particularly in a preventative way and particularly outside of the criminal justice system, meaning that behaviour often needs to escalate to a level of someone getting hurt for anything to be done about it. But people who have been violent do deserve to be able to one day live a life where they can interact with people without causing harm. And that would be good for everybody in the community, in society. But that requires building systems of accountability and rehabilitation to work together and we need to grant more nuance to what we think justice can be. So we need to understand that violence is human and tackle environmental contributors to violence rather than just having a punitive approach against individuals. Amy popped in the chat a video that goes through a way of building accountability in people who've done harm really, really well. They're so much more eloquent than I am. So take 15 minutes to watch that at some point today if you can. So I know these are quite big conceptual ideas and they might seem quite disconnected from the day-to-day work that you do. Like I said, info team talk and think about this all the time. But whether it's kind of writing press copy or talking about like an individual service user, how we understand violence influences how we talk about it and respond to it. So these are useful things to keep in the back of your mind when these topics come up. You can ask yourself whether the way you're talking about violence is reinforcing stigma. Are you encouraging understanding? Are you being dismissive? And is the way you're talking or reacting around this subject leading to constructive results, which we'll get into how to do that a bit more later. With all of that context, let's now have a look at the connections between violence and mental health. So historically, Mind, but also pretty much every other organization has struggled to talk about this subject with appropriate nuance. That's because it's really, really hard to do. Understandably, we want to combat the stigma that people with mental health problems are inherently violent. That's a really prevalent stereotype of diagnoses like schizophrenia and personality disorders. But we also need to make sure that in distancing ourselves from the stereotype, we don't go too far the other way and alienate people with more complex mental health experiences and insinuate that those people give everyone else a bad reputation. So, for example, in the work we do about combating stigma and OCD, we don't say in our information that OCD isn't about being clean. Because while there is a lot of stigma that OCD is just about being clean and washing your hands and being really neat, there are also people with OCD that presents in that way as well. So we are very comfortable talking about how mental health problems can cause people to be violent against themselves, whether that be self-harm or suicide. But we are less comfortable and less sympathetic when we talk about how those same mental health problems might express themselves in a way that causes harm to other people. So to start with, let's look at how mental health and violence are actually connected. Firstly, there is no mental health diagnosis for which a compulsory criteria is violence. That means there is no diagnosis that means 100% of the people with it will be violent. Some mental health problems include symptoms that can be expressed in violent ways under certain conditions, and other mental health problems have violence in the criteria that won't necessarily manifest in everyone with the diagnosis. We will go over both, but let's first take a look at some of those conditions that can increase the chance of any mental health symptom presenting in a more violent manner. So firstly is lack of treatment or poor quality treatment. Treatment and support is often really key to preventing violence. The London Violence Reduction Unit report on homicides reported that in most cases where someone with a mental health problem committed homicide, the perpetrator had recently experienced a disruption to their treatment. That could be abruptly stopping taking medication or being discharged from a service too early. And it is important to note here that while we are saying treatment is important in reducing violence, that doesn't necessarily mean sectioning. So there is kind of an attempt to be a bit more nuanced with reporting and talking about how, we need to take better care of people with certain mental health problems to stop violence from happening. But a lot of the time, that's kind of framed in a way of putting people in hospital and giving them treatments without their consent. But people still deserve to be part of compassionate and informed medical care wherever possible. And that can include treatments in the community rather than at hospital. The answer to violence isn't sectioning everybody. That is the answer to a problem that's already out of control. We need good quality treatment at very early stages of a mental health problem to make the biggest difference. Use of drugs and alcohol is also a contributor to violence. That's both for people with and without mental health problems. And this can be a really difficult area that intersects with the kind of lack of treatment stuff, because someone might use drugs or alcohol to cope with their mental health if they haven't been able to access treatment. And some services might refuse to treat someone with an active substance misuse problem. Previous history of violence can also be an indicator of further acts of violence, but that's like very contextual. So you shouldn't always assume that someone who's been violent in the past will be violent again, because if they have access, good support and treatment, they actually might be much less likely to be violent again than someone else who hasn't had that sort of support. So that's a bit of a tricky one. So now let's take a look at mental health problems that have violence within the diagnostic criteria. They will pop up in a second. This is intentionally blank for a while. Please keep in mind that even though some mental health problems have a greater connection to violence, that doesn't mean that everybody with that mental health problem will be violent. It is still very rare. And it's also worth highlighting that diagnostic criteria aren't perfect. They're part of a very medicalized approach to mental health that has a very narrow viewpoint and tends to kind of put a lot more individual focus on someone's mental health rather than looking at how things like trauma and stuff impact your mental health. But kind of regardless, they are useful to see how the medical system at least has categorized certain behaviors. So these three diagnoses have a criteria related to violence, aggression, or harming other people in them, according to the ICD-11. The ICD-11 is the World Health Organization classification of diseases. It's more up to date than the current DSM, which you might know as the American Manual for Mental Health Conditions. So complex PTSD is a form of PTSD that can occur after severe or ongoing trauma. It has a lot of similar symptoms to PTSD, but additionally includes severe problems with managing relationships, regulating emotions, or self-image. And part of those problems impacting regulation can be violent outbursts in response to triggers. That's not super surprising if you keep in mind that states of fear trigger the fight or flight response. I just feel like a lot of the time we don't really talk about the fight option. It's not depicted as much in like the media. Personality disorder is another one. So you might be more familiar with specific names of personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder, but the diagnostic structure has actually recently changed. So people will now be kind of given a personality disorder label that is then categorized as mild, moderate, or severe. And within that, you can have a combination of different traits. That's a relatively recent update. Amy has popped into the chat the link to the Mind info on personality disorders, which has a little bit more context if you want to learn about it. It is super interesting. Violent behavior falls under one of these traits, which is called the dissociality trait. And that is characterized by expressing little or limited empathy for other people that in extreme circumstances can include being violent towards them. Again, not everybody with a personality disorder will have that trait, but some people will. And I guess it's quite interesting that this specific form of violence, so the kind that involves enjoying hurting others or not caring about your impact on others, is kind of how we see all types of violence a lot of the time. But there are still complexities within this. So there is a lot of reasons why someone's behavior and emotions might manifest this way. We know that personality disorders have a really big connection to experiences of trauma. So there are a lot of reasons why someone's emotions develop and their relationships to other people develop in that way. Fabricated illness imposed on another is also called Munchausen's by proxy. Is a very interesting one. So this is when a parent or a caregiver intentionally makes someone, often a child, sick or seeks constant medical treatment for an exaggerated illness. And there are actually different opinions on whether this is a mental health problem at all. So the NHS says that this is a form of child abuse and not a mental health problem. But the DSM and the ICD-11 say that it is an abusive behavior, but it is caused by a mental illness. So it's like an unclear area that's very up for debate. But even though the NHS say it's an abusive behavior, it does identify that a large number of people who do it have a personality disorder diagnosis that could play a part in the emotional motivations behind the abuse. And it can also happen in very extreme cases of health anxiety. Then outside of these, there are also things like impulse control disorders and conduct dissocial disorder. They are behavioral disorders and they sit on kind of a strange boundary between mental health and neurological conditions. So they're not really 100% our game, but they like cross over a lot. Impulse control disorders includes things like pyromania, so compulsively lighting fires, and conduct dissocial disorder is seen in children, and it's defined as behavior that violates the rights of others, and that can be expressed as theft, hurting people or animals, or extreme rule breaking. And those behaviors can coexist with mental health problems or be caused by them as well. It's why it sits in this like weird boundary, but they're kind of like in the playing field as well, but just like not 100% our area. So maybe some of you are wondering why schizophrenia wasn't in the previous list, because that is the big diagnosis we see reported on when it comes to mental health and violence. And the reason it's not there is because violent behavior is not a diagnostic criteria of schizophrenia at all. And that circles back to those quotes from the media team about violence reporting failing to capture that nuance. Violent behavior in schizophrenia is normally related to psychosis, which can be a symptom of a lot of mental health problems, including like severe depression. And psychosis itself isn't even defined as a violent symptom. It all comes down to context. So psychosis includes experiences of hallucinations, so hearing voices, seeing things, and delusions, which are unfounded beliefs about reality. And it also includes disorganized thinking or speech. Amy popped a link to psychosis in the chat for anybody who needs to know more about that. Not all experiences of psychosis lead to violence. The vast majority of them don't. Again, it's all going to depend on how the psychosis manifests and how much support the person has to manage it as well. So, for example, if someone has a delusion that leads them to believe that they can control the weather with their mind, probably not going to end up being violent, right? But if someone has a delusion that people are out to get them and that they feel very unsafe and they don't have support, they might be much more likely to hurt others under belief that they need to protect themselves or someone else. So that's kind of like how psychosis ends up in this like violent spectrum. But it's very, very, very contextual and definitely not a given if you experience psychosis. So as has been said quite continuously in the presentation, people with mental health problems are still very unlikely to be violent and are more likely to hurt themselves than someone else. But it is very unhelpful if we just leave the conversation there, because the people who may have their experiences coded as violent are more likely to be experiencing highly stigmatized mental health problems. When violence happens and we choose to just say, well, most people with mental health problems aren't violent, we are kind of instantly othering anybody who has been violent, and we're telegraphing that we can't support those people properly, very clearly. We're also creating a dichotomy between people with common mental health problems and other mental health problems, and we're sort of suggesting that the other ones are the violent ones and the bad ones and the evil ones. And in doing so, that communicates that it's okay to stigmatize those people because we aren't willing to encourage understanding about it or combat the stigma we see in how these experiences are reported. Let's think back to the OCD example. Yes, you want to combat the stigma that OCD is just about washing your hands all the time, but we don't want to dismiss the experiences of people who have OCD and do have that compulsion. And let's talk about a violence-based example. So there are cases where experiences of postpartum mental health problems, so it could be postpartum psychosis or depression, have led to a child being harmed. That's most likely to occur again when the person doesn't have proper support or treatment. So we potentially have a scenario where someone who experiences a very severe mental health episode, they get no support for it, and it's unfortunately resulted in them harming their child. And that is a very, very stigmatizing situation to be in. There'd be a huge amount of stigma and shame that someone is going to experience for that. And then think about how absolutely unproductive it would be if a mental health organization addressed that by just saying, well, most people with postpartum depression don't do that. It's not very helpful. It's not very destigmatizing. And dismissing it as an outlier doesn't foster an environment that will create the systems of support that prevent experiences like that from happening either. We aren't an organisation that litigates someone's personal responsibility for a crime. We're an organisation that supports people with mental health problems. And we can't do that if we deny the experiences of the least understood mental health presentations and treat them like they give the rest of mental health a bad name. And when it comes to violence and mental health, we have a real opportunity to shed light on some of the systemic failures in the mental health system that leads to these events. So to finish up, I'm going to talk about how we can address those stigmas in the work that we do. So we aren't in charge of prison services or legislation or what goes on the front page of the Daily Mail, but that doesn't mean we can't have influence. We can encourage external services to talk about mental health and violence with more nuance, and we can lead by example. The way we talk and write about these topics matters. We are like the big mental health charity in the UK. So I'm going to share some examples of what the information and media team have written about the topics of violence and mental health, which puts some of those destigmatizing tools into action. So this is an extract from Mind's recent information on psychosis. Prior to this recent update, the information didn't address what to do if you felt like you were going to hurt someone else, but we recognized that that was something we actually needed to change. So I will read it out loud. It says, what if I feel like I might hurt myself or others? When experiencing psychosis, you may have hallucinations or delusions about harming yourself or others. For example, you might hear voices that tell you to hurt yourself or experience a delusion that someone is trying to hurt you, so you feel like you need to act to defend yourself. These experiences can be really frightening. It's important that you get urgent support if you feel that you're at risk to yourself or others, etc. So some key things we do here are, whoops, got ahead of myself. We normalize the experience and we acknowledge that it happens, which we weren't saying before. So that is also helped by putting it alongside the experience of hurting yourself. It sort of shows that these two behaviors are often rooted in the same system. You know, one of them's not this like huge outlier thing. And we also use language that puts the person first. So we say you like multiple times instead of saying a person with psychosis might do this. We also acknowledge that experience this can be very distressing for you and not just other people in there. And we tell you that you can get urgent support as well. So this is a media statement Mind put out following the investigation into the mental health care of Valdo Callicane, who caused the deaths of 3 people in 2023 during a period of psychosis. Amy has put the link into the full statement in the chat if anyone wants to read it, but I'll just read out kind of parts of this core section. So it says, it's all too clear that there was a series of missed opportunities alongside systemic failures. Under-resourced services, poor communications, a failure to properly listen and to involve Valdo Callicane's family all meant he fell through the cracks in the system with devastating consequences. People with mental illness must be held accountable when they commit serious crimes, but when people are unwell, they need to be treated with respect and able to access adequately funded mental health services, which can intervene early and provide ongoing support. Strong local partnerships between services that include carers and communities are critical to ensure the right decisions around someone's care are taken at the right time, and this is especially true for people from racialized communities who are more likely to experience poor care and worse outcomes. So this statement acknowledges that there's harm caused over there. It doesn't say that like this didn't impact anybody, but it also calls for respect and understanding to those who are unwell, which is what this whole section is about. It highlights the systemic issues that contributed to the case, which are in line with the areas that Mind actively campaigns on, so things like racialized communities and improving quality of care for people. And it's not distancing itself from the fact that mental health was a factor in this case either, which I think like in previous times we've done. And we don't advocate for a sectioning only response. We're not saying this was terrible and so yes, we should section people like this. It highlights that need for early care and personalized care and long-term support that people can access that is right for them. And then this last example is from the draft of our soon-to-be updated page on treatment in hospital. This info isn't on the current live page, so there's no link to it, but I will read it out to you. The text is probably subject to change a bit because it's in draft form, but it'll probably stay kind of like this. So it says, if your behavior is seen as violent or aggressive, sometimes a symptom of your mental health problem might make you act in a way that make others people feel unsafe. You might not be aware you are doing this, or you might think you need to act this way to keep yourself safe. This could include yelling, threatening other people, hurting, or trying to hurt other people. Even if you are doing these things, you shouldn't be turned away from A&E or hospital, but professionals might need to take action to keep people safe if you are not able to stop. This could include giving you medication. So again, we reframe violence here as something that is people's perspective of your behavior rather than innately something about you. So we're not saying if you are being violent, this is what will happen. We are saying if you are being seen as being violent, this is what will happen to you. We also clearly acknowledge that you might not know that you're hurting other people, or you might think that you have to do that in that moment as well. And we also tell people that they still deserve treatment. We don't say, well, if you're doing that, then no one's going to help you. But we do explain the ways that other people might then respond to your behaviors. But this is, again, foregrounding the person that we're talking about, rather than talking about them as some other thing. So when it comes to writing or discussing violence in your own teams or workplaces, whether that's for public-facing content or just internal discussions about these topics, here are some things to keep in mind to make sure that we're addressing it constructively. So challenge stigma with nuance. You definitely should challenge the idea that violence is implicit in all mental health problems, but make sure you aren't othering people who have been violent as a result of their mental health problem. So absolutely, people who are violent as a result of their mental health is a minority, but so are people who are violent in general. And just because it doesn't happen often or to everybody, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen at all. And if we ignore it, then we're compounding the stigma on it and we're narrowing how useful and helpful we can be to these people. So definitely highlight those important elements about the need for good quality treatment and be symptom specific rather than assign a whole diagnosis of violence. But even within that symptom specificity, explain why they will sometimes be expressed through violence at one point, but not at another. Learning more is always good. That's why you're here. This is a really complex topic. As I said, some of you might know everything that I've talked about, and for some of you, this is going to be very new. But I guess take this opportunity to learn some more and embed that learning. I've put together a summary of the evidence using this presentation that we will share in the chat, and that can be a helpful starting point. Consume media really critically. Look at how the media reports on violent incidences and notice how they describe people, acts, and reasons if they give a reason. Notice where they generalize mental health problems and their associations in violence, but also notice where you might be replicating those kind of narratives because it's very, very easy to do. And it is the main narrative we see about these problems. So it's kind of about catching yourself there and trying to do better. And then finally, just don't shy away from it. As we explored, ignoring this topic and hiding too much behind the fact that most people with mental health problems aren't violent feeds into stigma about less understood mental health experiences. If you have the tools to talk about this topic, please do. And if you want help building those tools, that's where people in the info team and also the media team can be really helpful if you need us. So that is the end of the me talking bit of this presentation. Thank you again for taking the time to come and listen. Information team email address is at the top of the screen and in the chat as well. If you want to follow up with this or kind of anything mental health information related, we would really love to hear from you. We've also popped a document in the chat which has a bunch of references and learning from this presentation if anyone is interested. It's also, instead of sharing the slides, that is a summary of kind of all the main points. And at the end, there is a big list of various things you can read and watch and listen to if this is a topic that interests you as much as it interests me. So if anyone wants to stay and ask questions, we will do that now, but also feel free to leave. It is lunchtime. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, you could take the extra time to have a proper break would be good. Yeah, even if you don't think that you were affected by any of the content, just take a break anyway. It's not going to harm you. So yeah, that is the end. I'll stop sharing and finally look at the chat because I've not been looking at it this whole time. Yeah, thank you everybody. Is there anything that anybody would like to talk about or ask a question about? I won't be offended if not. You can go home if you want to.
So I don't think there's any questions at the moment in the chat or the Q&A, but I'll just take the minute. Thank you so much, Alyssa. That was so interesting. We've had these conversations before, but I always feel like I learned so much when you talk about this topic. It was really, really interesting. So yeah, thank you.
It's very nice. Thank you for all the love in the chat as well. Yeah, if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or go off mute or put it in the chat. But if no one has anything, then we're all done. I'm going to take the silence as a there is nothing further. So yeah, we can finish things up now. Tanya, I think you're in charge of ending the meeting. So yeah, thank you everybody.
So much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.